Hey YouTube, Ethan here. Today's video is going to be about infinite oil production and oxygen not included. Of course, by infinite oil production, I'm talking about making use of the oil reservoirs that are found typically in the oil biome and oxygen not included. As with all of my 4 beginner video tutorials, this is going to cover only the very basics that beginners would need to make the transition from early game to mid game by starting their oil production and getting it online. Therefore, I'm only going to be covering the features on the Terra asteroid, which will obviously be different than other asteroids that are more difficult, especially if they have different traits, such as the irregular oil trait that is included before you start the game. There are many different ways you can get oil and oxygen not included, and typically it'll also be found in abundance when you get to the very bottom of the Terra asteroid, as long as you don't have the frozen core. Although this oil seems like a large pool, it is not as much as it looks, and you can run off fairly quickly if you're doing a lot of space travel or if your entire base infrastructure and power grid relies on oil production. So what we're going to discuss is different methods you can produce oil even before you make it all the way down to the oil biome, which is very hard for new players if they don't have the proper infrastructure set up with atmos suits and oxygen production. As I said earlier, oil is typically one of the main transition points from early game to mid game, and it requires sufficient power and infrastructure setup in terms of having atmos suits available so your duplicants can safely work in the increased temperature environments, such as Ada here. Otherwise, they will be very hot and uncomfortable when they come down in this area. And as you can see, there is not a lot of breathable gas. It's mostly very hot polluted oxygen, a lot of chlorine, and the oil is very hot in and of itself, so it's not something pleasant for your duplicants to be exposed to. Now, there are a couple of reasons you want to get oil if you're a new player, and if you haven't gotten this far in the game yet. Oil is very useful in many different applications. Crude oil has a very high vaporization temperature, so it can be an effective liquid lock for almost any scenario, such as using it for taming volcanoes, like this iron volcano right here. It also works for gold volcanoes, and so on. You can see that the temperature inside of this gold volcano tamer is 154 degrees Celsius, and the crude oil is at a comfortable 137 degrees. Now, just as a side note, I say comfortable because the oil is very far away from ever becoming vaporized at this temperature. However, it is providing a lot of heat transfer to the outer area of the volcano tamer, if we take a look at the temperature overlay. But because our ambient temperature around this tamer is relatively cool, it is not providing an extreme amount of heat to the outskirts because the airflow in this area is contained mostly within this little block. You can definitely stop most, if not all, of the heat transfer if you use a double liquid lock with a vacuum space in between. So I don't use that in this scenario because it is not needed. This is not in my immediate base. As you can see, my base is all the way down here. And I'm not using this outer area for anything at all. So a temperature increase in this area to me is trivial. But let's move on. Crude oil can also be used by itself as a coolant method for any volcano tamer that you wish to make. And this works great because its freezing point is a lot lower than comparable liquids that you might want to use, such as polluted water. Even though in this case, I'm not cooling my oil all the way down to minus 40 degrees, and therefore I could have very well used polluted water. Crude oil is a set it and forget it method, so you generally don't have to worry about your temperature ranges when you're using it as a coolant. Especially if you're a new player who doesn't want to be bothered with dialing in the most efficient way to cool something, crude oil will work great as a set it and forget it option that you can prime a cooling loop with, and you generally won't have to worry about ever it heating up too high or becoming so cold that it will freeze. And a great example of this is the metal refineries that are producing steel. The temperature of the oil coming out is nearly 300 degrees. And this is something I don't have to worry about because the crude oil temperature range allows me to somewhat carelessly run it without consideration to very specific heat ranges. Most of the time when you accumulate crude oil, you'll want to convert it into petroleum. And this is done through the oil refinery. The oil refinery is not going to be covered in this video, but it is relatively easy to set up and figure out. However, I will be making a video on that at some point, and I'll be showing an efficient setup that you can use to capture most of the byproducts of the oil refinery. Some of the benefits of petroleum compared to crude oil is that it has a higher vaporization temperature than crude oil, and petroleum also has a lower freezing temperature than crude oil. If you're working with extreme temperature ranges and don't have access to space materials or more advanced liquids, petroleum is probably going to be your best bet to handle those extreme temperatures, at least as far as how simplistic they are to come by. One of the most popular uses for petroleum, especially early on when you first get access to it, is going to be the petroleum generators. These put out a ridiculous 2000 watts of power, so they are very useful as your main power source for the entire game, especially because crude oil in general can come in infinite amounts if you have enough oil wells set up throughout your map. The petroleum generators output a ton of polluted water, and I do mean a ton. By this time, you're probably already familiar with natural gas generators, which also output polluted water as a byproduct of their operation. But you can see the chamber that I have set up for the polluted water is significantly smaller than the one I have set up for the petroleum generators. And I have a lot less petroleum generators and way more polluted water to deal with. So these are just some of the considerations you'll want to make when you're using petroleum generators. However, that's not the point of this video, and I'm going to be skipping past petroleum generators for now. They are fairly easy to set up, and it's fairly easy to also deal with the byproduct. Another very popular use for petroleum is the polymer press, which creates plastic. Plastic is going to be a very critical component for you to get access to in the mid-game phase of your playthrough. The benefit of the polymer press over other methods of getting plastic is that it's incredibly easy to set up to begin your initial plastic production. However, there are a lot of downsides to it, and I cover that in a separate video called Plastic Production for Beginners. And lastly, in the very end game phase of your playthrough, you'll want to use petroleum for your petroleum rocket engines, which are much more efficient than the initial engines that you start out with. I don't have them unlocked in this particular playthrough, so I can't show an example. That's not what this video is about anyway, so I'm going to skip past that. The point is that oil is a very critical component for aggressively expanding your base when you start the mid-game phase of your playthrough, because it is going to allow you to work with extreme temperature ranges that you haven't been able to work with prior to accessing oil, and you're going to produce immense amount of power for your base so that you can rapidly expand your infrastructure. So to start with, how do you find oil? When you play on the Terra asteroid, oil is going to be found at the very bottom of your map. This is generally referred to as the oil biome, and it is an extremely inhospitable place for your duplicants to be in. You may be able to send duplicants down temporarily, maybe just long enough to build a liquid pump on the surface. Generally, you always want to have Atmos suits unlocked by this point because it will allow your duplicants to work much more efficiently. Otherwise, they'll constantly be gasping for air and trying to save themselves from getting too hot. So we can see this duplicant, he's perfectly fine in his Atmos suit. And this is exactly why it's so important to have Atmos suits. And of course, I have a video on that as well for beginners, so check that out if you haven't got to your Atmos suits yet. The easiest method to obtain oil, if you're lucky enough to get Slickster eggs from the printing pod, is to simply grow your Slicksters. These guys will eat carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they will excrete crude oil. They are incredibly easy to set up. As you can see, I have maybe a dozen Slicksters, and they are all eating the crude oil that is coming down from these airflow tiles as the carbon dioxide makes its way into this area. These Slicksters require a lot of manual labor in the sense that when they excrete the crude oil, it just goes on the floor as if somebody spilled some type of liquid, and your duplicants will have to come wipe it up. Not only that, but then they'll have to transfer it into a storage area or your existing piping infrastructure. So for this playthrough, I'm using a sweepy bot to sweep up the crude oil, which my duplicants can then pick up. But another thing to note with the Slicksters is that you don't really have to wrench them in order to have crude oil production from them. You can see that these Slicksters are all wild, and as long as they're contained in an area where their health is not immediately being harmed, they survive perfectly fine by breathing in the excess carbon dioxide from your duplicants breathing naturally. You can even go one step farther and direct all carbon dioxide that accumulates at the bottom of your base, like I'm doing here, and pump it directly into the area where your Slicksters are if they're not directly located at the very bottom of your base. This is actually a great alternative than dumping your carbon dioxide into space, which is something that I generally do when I first start a playthrough. However, if you get Slickster eggs from the printing pod early enough, you can set up one of these containment areas where the Slicksters can hatch and grow and breathe in the excess carbon dioxide from your duplicates. Of course, if you like, you can definitely dedicate dupe time to wrench the Slicksters, and that will also enhance your meat production for barbecue within your base. Of course, for something better than Slicksters, we're going to be talking about oil reservoirs. Oil reservoirs spawn on the map just as any other geyser or vent would. However, the main difference is that there's no neutronomium on the bottom of the oil reservoir. This means that the bottom can be completely dug out, and you can put a block of tile underneath without any consequences. Now, oil reservoirs on their own don't actually do anything. This will just sit idle and nothing will come out of it unless you directly build a building on top of it. The only thing that you can build on top of the reservoir is the oil well. This is not an extremely hard building to set up. It needs very few inputs and interventions. It does require 240 watts of power, and it also requires 1000 grams per second of water. One of the unique characteristics of the oil well is that we'll also overpressurize, so a duplicate will need to come and intervene and release the pressure that is built up so it can continue producing oil. But unlike other geysers, the oil production will be essentially infinite, hence where the title of this video comes from, Infinite Oil Production. There's no downtime for the oil reservoir. It just keeps working as long as you have power and water hooked up to the oil well. Now, the way the pressure system works is via the back pressure release threshold setting when you click on the oil well itself. And this will tell the duplicants when to release the pressure. So far, I have found that throughout my playthroughs, this number is quite arbitrary, and it really just depends on how frequently you want duplicants to come and release the pressure. Unlike other geysers and vents that you'll tame, the oil well does not need to be built out of steel. The temperatures will generally never become hot enough for you to overheat the oil well, and from my experience, everything inside the room that you build can also be built out of gold without any consequences. This is what it looks like when Amari comes to release the pressure. And we can see that the pressure being released is actually 100% natural gas. It releases around 110 degrees Celsius, and it kind of sounds like a steam engine whistle. During this time, there will be no oil production, but as soon as Amari leaves, the oil production resumes. And like I said, from my experience, this room never seems to get hot enough to melt gold, so you can safely build it using starting asteroid materials before you even get steel. One of the reasons you would want to have a room like this built for the oil well is to capture the natural gas that gets dispersed when the back pressure is released. This is not necessary at all, and you can simply vent the natural gas out into the atmosphere. But since natural gas can be used for power, this is a great way to capture any residual natural gas and send it to natural gas generators. Likewise, the oil well will simply allow the oil to drain wherever it is currently working, so you don't necessarily need to have a liquid pump in this room either. Let's take a look at these two setups and see what is going on inside both. I have a gas pump that is sending the residual natural gas from the back pressure releases into my natural gas chamber where my natural gas geysers are. I did this because it is the closest location to deposit the natural gas, but I could have sent it right into my feeding tube for my natural gas generators. I just decided not to. I have an Atmos sensor here that only turns on when the pressure is over 500 grams. 500 grams to me is just an arbitrary number to keep this room from being completely vacuumed out. Although arguably you can set it to 1000 grams, so you have full packets of natural gas going through the pipes at all times. The middle sensor is used to turn the oil well off and on. While this isn't technically necessary as long as the liquid pump is always going, I like to have it in case there's a malfunction with the pump setup itself. The oil well will shut off and the gas pump will not be fully submerged. And finally, I have another hydro sensor which controls the delivery of the oil from the liquid pump. And in this playthrough, I'm simply sending the oil overboard into my oil pit that is down below. And it's the exact same setup for both chambers. Having a simple setup like this and modified to your liking and to your playthrough style will allow you to have essentially infinite oil throughout your entire playthrough, as long as you can keep the 240 watts available for this oil well to run. And because petroleum generators generate so much power, these are technically power positive buildings all on their own. We have the gas pump and the liquid pump and the oil well that all take 240 watts of power, but not all three of them will run at the same time. You'll always have the oil well running, but at most you'll have 480 watts of power being used because when the gas pump is running, the oil well will not be. This is because when the back pressure is being released, the gas pump will run, but the oil well will not. So if you take into account the 480 watts of power that you're using in one of these chambers, and then the power necessary to convert the crude oil into petroleum at another 480 watts, that comes well below the 2000 watts that one petroleum generator produces. The only thing that we haven't factored in is the water supply needed to keep the oil well running. And in my case, I'm taking water from a cool steam vent that is closer to the bottom of my base. And I'm also using a pump that requires another 240 watts of power. So to recap, utilizing oil wells as early as possible will allow you to have a huge boost in production in your colony because of the insane amounts of power that you'll be making. And as you can see in the setup, you can use gold amalgam for most of these buildings, and as long as you control the natural gas ventilation properly, you shouldn't have any problem with overheating affecting any of these buildings. I did forget to mention that the way I'm collecting oil from this very large basin where both of my oil pumps are currently flooding is from another liquid pump that should be relocated at this point because of all the digging I've done. But that's another 240 watts of power, although this could technically be eliminated if you route the oil coming out of your oil reservoirs and your oil well into a separate holding tank instead of simply dumping it overboard like I am. So there's a lot of considerations and optimizations that can be made to a build like this. Keep in mind that with all of my builds, I try to make them as new player friendly as possible. So there are definitely way more advanced and optimized methods that you can go about getting your infinite oil production. One thing that I did not cover in this video is the use of the leaky oil fissure. This is because the crude oil that comes out of the oil fissure is 326 degrees, and unlike gases or other substances that you'll be encountering with very hot geysers and oxygen not included, oil does not cool very quickly. It retains its heat very well, and this oil comes out at a higher temperature than steel melts at. So I don't believe this is a new player friendly geyser to work with, and therefore I will not be including it in this video. That will be a video on its own. So this was the video on infinite oil production and oxygen not included. I hope that if you're a new player, this was helpful for you in understanding more of the mechanics involved in oil production and what it takes to get your oil production started. Also, I hope this gives you some insight on just how easy it can be to start your oil production and why you should rush for it as early as you possibly can so you have the insane benefits that having access to crude oil will give you. I hope this video shows just how easy it is to deal with if you put enough planning into the infrastructure for it. With that being said, if you're a much more experienced player, this video may not be as helpful for you as it will be for someone who is newer at the game. However, I still hope that you leave your comment and feedback down below. Your comment and feedback not only helps me grow on YouTube by highlighting areas that I should be focusing on or information that I'm leaving out in my videos, but it also helps new players when they read the comment section to get tips that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten from the video. So any of your feedback or criticisms is highly appreciated. And if you're a new player, please feel free to let me know if this video was helpful for you and if you've gotten to the oil biome so far in your playthrough. If you have any questions, please leave them below and I will try to get to them as soon as possible. Until next time, I'm Ethan, and I'll see you later.